Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 22, which begins a new thematic arc about the visual culture of social justice. This week, we're going to travel to 19th century Europe to look at some of the earliest artworks tackling matters of social justice, particularly in terms of class issues and the costs of human folly and war. Today, we'll begin with the great Spanish artist Francisco Goya and discuss some of his most powerful works, many of which maintain their relevance after more than 200 years. On Wednesday, we'll travel to France and consider the art of Honoré Daumier and his always sharp and frequently amusing commentary on modern society and class struggles. As always, we will pause here for a moment to relax before we begin. And this short video will give us a brief overview of Goya's career.
Francisco Goya is one of the most important Spanish painters. He was born on March 30th, 1746, in the village of Fuendetodos, near Zaragoza, into a middle-class family. He studied under José Luzán, concentrating on works by Tiepolo and Mengs. In 1769, he traveled throughout Italy in order to study artworks by master artists from the past. In 1775, he obtained his first important assignment. Spanish royal authorities commissioned him to create a series of sketches for tapestries destined for the royal family's summer residence. The style Goya employed in the drawings was still connected to 18th century traditions, but his choice to portray happy scenes of everyday life instead of mythological subjects was innovative and marked the beginning of his professional ascent. Goya's flamboyantly colorful painting fascinated aristocracy in Madrid. He was commissioned to paint several portraits and within 10 years became an official court painter. But Goya was soon struck by a serious illness that left him completely deaf. This disability made his painting gloomy and visionary. Dark tones, dramatic accents, and distressing images prevailed. Despite his disease, Goya's career advanced, and he was made first court painter in 1799. At court, he painted a renowned portrait of the royal family. By then, his style had changed. The sovereigns are almost caricatures, and their features are close to grotesque. At the same time, he unveiled a series of etchings, the Caprices. His satirical vein was expressed in more than 80 panels, through which the artist denounced human vices and hypocrisy common to all societies. In the early years of the 19th century, Goya dedicated himself mostly to painting portraits of women, among them the famous La Maja Desnuda, doing so despite Inquisition rules that prohibited the representation of female nudity. During Napoleon's rule, Goya retained his place at court. He realized a series of etchings and paintings denouncing the atrocities of war. The 3rd of May, 1808, his most intense and dramatic work, became the symbol of Spanish resistance against its French invader. With the return of the Spanish sovereigns, his role at court became uncertain. He retired to his country home, called the Quinta del Sordo, where he painted the walls with the mournful and menacing black paintings. Goya's last years were spent in Bordeaux, where he returned to more conventional subjects, similar to those of his youth. He died in Bordeaux on April 16, 1828. He was 81. Thanks to his ability to depict man's irrational drives, Goya is considered a precursor of Romanticism. His influence extended over much of the artistic culture of the 20th century.
Goya began as a painter in the bright, light-hearted palette and subject matter of the Rococo, but it was not long before his style changed, reflecting his conflicted feelings about the Spanish Enlightenment. As you just heard, he was born into a middle-class family and enjoyed a comfortable but practical upbringing. Such practicality would remain a characteristic his whole life, even when he was elevated to the highest office possible for an artist, that of first court painter under King Charles IV. He would go on to become one of the most prolific creators of protest art ever. Over the course of his long career, Goya painted many self-portraits, including this one, produced sometime between 1795 and 1797. It is a particular favorite of mine, mostly because it seems especially introspective. We're not sure if he made it for a patron, as a study for another work, or if he made it strictly for himself. I suggest it's the latter for a few reasons. First, it appears unfinished because his garments are only sketched in, which, yes, could also count if it were a study. But there is nothing unfinished in the intensity of his expression. The drawing appears to be split between the two strongest aspects of his personality. On the one hand, there is his appreciation for ordinary people and situations, as noted in the short bio you just watched, and his hope for a brighter future for Spain. On the other is his deep skepticism regarding the supposed societal improvements that were supposed to come about as a result of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason. Goya was considered a romantic realist, and as such he recognized that there was light where there was light. He recognized that where there was light, there must also be darkness. Where there was hope, so there was despair. Where there was reason, there was also madness. Quite literally, we are presented with a dark half and a light one, and the dichotomy is made even more obvious if you hold your hand over first one side of the portrait and then the other, and consider the differences. For example, look at his hair. On the left side, the dark side, the hair is darker and unrulier than on the right. On the right side, the curls are more orderly, and the ends lift up rather than tangling into themselves. The left side of the face is drawn in shadow, while the right side receives the light. There is a greater tension in the left side of his face, pulling the eyebrow down and the lower lip up, creating a grimmer effect. The right side is more relaxed, creating a gentler countenance. The right eyebrow is slightly raised, lending his gaze a more inquisitive and interested appearance. His mouth on the right side even hints a bit at the suggestion of a smile. Now consider the gaze. At first it might seem that he is looking directly out at the viewer, but look again. While the right eye does indeed seem to suggest this, the left eye does not. On that side, the gaze is distinctly turned inward. It is remarkable how much is going on in this deceptively simple portrait. In his excellent book, The Self-Portraits of Francisco Goya, Dr. John Chiafalo writes of Dr. Jekyll at the mirror watching his metamorphosis into Mr. Hyde. And indeed, once you see these formal differences, it's easy enough to make such a connection. Even in his earlier works, like this painting that seems on the surface to be depicting a moment of innocent fun, it also contains some elements of social criticism. As we'll see in several of the prints in his Los Caprichos collection, Goya was critical of a system that he felt was hypocritical in its treatment of women, but he also had a problem with women he felt held too much power over men. In this painting, a group of 4 young women bounce a male mannequin on a blanket, but there is something distinctly unsettling here. This was one of the last few cartoons commissioned by King Charles IV to decorate one of his apartments in the Fiscorial, the royal residence in Madrid, right there. The king had requested pictures that were, quote, rural and jocose, end quote, or jocular, showing scenes of adults enjoying childish games, and Goya reluctantly complied. He was not pleased with the subject matter, though. He was more interested in portraiture, and especially in creating art dealing with more serious subjects. He had little patience for frivolity, and it shows here. Look closely at the mannequin's expression and the powerlessness of its limbs, especially the angle of its right leg, which looks dislocated at both hip and knee. And the face also bears consideration. It's natural to expect the face of an inanimate object, so to speak, to be mask-like, but there is something uncomfortably human in the eyes. Although the smile is literally painted on, the curve of the eyebrows above the wide eyes suggests a certain helplessness in his plight. The women, too, are more complicated than one might expect to encounter in such a scene. Their faces, like that of the mannequin, appear almost mask-like, and although the women are painted in the lovely colors of the Rococo, a style known for its palette of sweet pastels appropriate for light-hearted subjects, a couple of these women appear to take a somewhat sadistic pleasure in their game, while others seem only vaguely present, like this woman here on the left, or have checked out, this woman on the left, or have checked out completely, like this woman on the right. This is Goya's famous group portrait of the entire royal family of Charles IV, and it is especially pungent in its unflinching realism. The artist made some very interesting choices here, choices that could have gotten him into trouble under a different king. But Charles IV genuinely liked Goya and appreciated his work. In this painting, Goya presents the royal family tricked out in all their regal glory. In fact, their fashionable garments appear downright garish, especially when compared with what many believe are deliberately unflattering depictions of their physical appearance. But the king and each member of his family gave their approval for all of Goya's preparatory work, so apparently they had no problem with his warts and all realism. Note, though, that although they stand close together, with just a couple of exceptions, they seem completely unengaged with one another, gazing off in all different directions. Again, the king admired Goya, and that would allow Goya to get away with not just his subtle criticisms in this painting, but in other works that were far less subtle as well. Notice that he has the queen at the center and the king off to the right. He balances this hierarchy a bit by placing the king before a lighter background, but it was acknowledged by many that Queen Maria Louisa was the real power in the family. Now, so here, this is the queen here. So here are a few details. On the left is a portrait of the king. Although his clothing is covered in medals and custom jewels designed by the court jeweler, the face above all this fanciness is plain and unidealized, and the expression is rather doltish. Queen Maria Louisa stands holding the hands of her two youngest children. The little girl wears a dress identical to her mother's, although her only jewelry is a pair of earrings and a hair ornament just like the queen's. The little boy directs his rather unsettling gaze directly at the viewer. There had long been rumors of the Queen's affair with the Spanish Prime Minister Manuel Godoy. There he is right there. And many believe he was the father of her two youngest children. Some see a resemblance to him in Goya's painting, and it may help explain why their mother is depicted showing them some tenderness, drawing her daughter close on one side and gently holding Francisco's hand. Still, her own appearance is just as coarse as her husband's, and she even appears to be painted toothless. Whether the rumors about Godoy and the Queen were true, the king, who was not a strong ruler, remained an advocate of Godoy and afforded him considerable power. In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte once wrote to Charles IV that Godoy was the real king of Spain, and revealed him to be the Queen's lover. When the royal family was ultimately exiled from Spain during Napoleon's invasion and the placement of his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne in 1808, it was Godoy who had first allowed the French troops into Spain under the belief that they would help him conquer Portugal, with which Spain was at war. He underestimated Napoleon's goals, however, with disastrous results for Spain. And we will see Goya's response in a few moments. On the far left of the painting, we see the king's middle son, Carlos Maria Isidro, and the eldest son and heir to the throne, Ferdinand VII, who despised Godoy and would later consider a coup d'etat against his own father. When he ultimately took the throne, it was because his father abdicated during an uprising by Spanish citizens who believed the king's favorite, Godoy, had sold out Spain to Napoleon in exchange for an elevated position of his own. That did not happen, though. Instead, Ferdinand, Godoy, and Charles IV would be tricked into traveling to France, and Joseph Bonaparte would be named King of Spain in 1808 by his brother, like I just said. He would remain so until 1814, when Ferdinand VII would regain the throne. So, here's the middle son, Carlos, and here is Ferdinand VII. Although more popular than his father prior to the French takeover, Ferdinand would go on to be one of the most unpopular, even hated kings of Spain. Through all of this, Goya, seen in his self-portrait almost lost in the shadows back there, there's Goya, would retain his post as primary court painter. His placement in this painting suggests that he is present as a witness only. This could be a humble statement. It could also be a prudent one. As I've said, he was quite critical of the Spanish rulers. Goya was not a fan of King Ferdinand either, and we can perceive this in this unflattering portrait made in 1815, after he had been restored to the Spanish throne. It is quite different from the more generous depiction in the family portrait. Also present here is the king's sister, shown with a large blemish on her face, and this mysterious young woman. It has been suggested that she is a stand-in for Ferdinand's future wife, who had not yet been chosen. She could also be the eldest daughter, Carlota Joaquina, who was for a time the Queen of Portugal and who was not present when the painting was made. Given that she, like the youngest girl, wears a dress identical to that of the queen, the latter identity seems more plausible. On the right side of the painting, we see a portrait of the king's brother, Don Antonio Pasquale, right there. The woman beside him, right here, may be his wife, or it may be his eldest daughter, or maybe King Charles's the Fourth's eldest daughter. For reasons I mentioned a minute ago, I think it's probably his brother's wife. At the far right are the Prince and Princess of Parma, Don Luis de Parma, who was French, and the second daughter of the Spanish monarchs, Maria Luisa. She was the favorite of Goya, who felt she was kind and genuine. It can be difficult to make out because Goya was so careful in his depiction, but Maria had a severely curved spine. Goya disguises it by showing her holding her baby, Carlos Luis, named for his grandfather and father, respectively. And here is the only other depiction of engagement within this family. Goya shows the baby gazing sweetly at his mother's lovely face. Right there. Just prior to creating the huge family portrait we've just been studying, Goya created one of his greatest collections of prints, Los Caprichos, or the Caprices, his critique of the destructive whims of people at the end of the 18th century, again during what was supposed to be a time of human elevation, the Enlightenment. Many of the prints expressed disdain for the pre-Enlightenment practices still popular in Spain at the end of the 18th century. Between 1796 and 1798, he produced 80 etchings that tackled everything from male and female relations among both the upper and lower classes to superstitious beliefs that certainly were not based in reason, corruption in the court system, and hypocrisy in the church. He published them in 1799. His criticisms were sometimes humorous, sometimes sympathetic, but always uncompromising. As a political liberal, he firmly believed that people had a lot of work to do if they hoped to achieve real enlightenment. He had no patience for ignorance or intellectual oppression. King Charles, perhaps not fully grasping the criticism within its pages, purchased the first volume of prints and is said to have loved them. Although this self-portrait was one of the last etchings he produced for the series, it was used as the frontispiece and is quite different from the self-portrait we began with. Here, Goya presents himself in elegant attire, in profile, giving the viewer the side eye. His pose is dignified and serious. He has lessons to teach. This is probably the most famous etching of the collection, and in its imagery and caption is conveyed a message universal to the whole series, with some seeing it as a manifesto of sorts. This is what happens when reason is absent. The inscription on the preparatory drawing for this print, now in the Prado Museum in Madrid, indicates that it was originally intended as the title page to the series. Many believe that it is another self-portrait with Goya shown either sleeping or despairing at his desk. Above him fly owls and bats, while a cat appears to crouch on the back of his chair. A lynx lies nearby. The message here is complicated. The title of the print reads, "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," which suggests that without reason we are at the mercy of the imagination. But in the full caption that appears with the published image, Goya had written, "Imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and source of their wonders." In other words, art is only possible when one tempers reason with imagination, and vice versa. Too much of either is destructive. This is where Goya's philosophy differs significantly from that of the Enlightenment and places him instead among the Romantics. The imagination is a good and necessary aspect of human nature. In plate 2, they say yes and give their hands to the first one that comes along. Goya criticizes women who make marriages a convenience and the men who exploit women's vulnerability. We see a pretty young woman wearing a mask to illustrate that although she will marry him, she will never show her groom her true face. And she is being escorted by an ugly but presumably wealthy old man. This is a mutual bargain, then, and one that Goya finds detestable. In this caprice, Goya addresses the relationship between prostitutes and their clients. Up in the tree, a pretty woman sits while a number of men literally flock toward her. She flirts with one to her right, while another approaches from the left, sure of his conquest. These two figures appear a number of times throughout the series, and it has been suggested that they represent Queen Maria Luisa and her purported lover, Manuel Godoy. Others suggest that the woman may be modeled after the Duchess of Alba, with whom Goya had a rather tortured affair that did not end well. She was one of those strong women he found so problematic, as was the Queen. Goya was careful, though, to include a disclaimer when he published the series, asserting that, quote, in none of the compositions which form part of this collection has the author proposed to ridicule the particular defects of any one individual, end quote. This was a wise choice. Anyway, seated on the ground beneath the tree are a very old woman who looks greedily up at the potential clients, there she is, and two younger women who are anally torturing another client who has been stripped of his feathers, or plucked. Plucked is an important word in this case because it means the same thing as fleecing or cheating and robbing the client. Once again, Goya is criticizing both the men and women who participate in prostitution. Another print on the same theme takes a more sympathetic stance toward the women, however. This time, Goya goes after the legal system, which is supposed to uphold the law, and instead is clearly determined to exploit the vulnerability of the woman who has just been arrested. And here's just a quick explanation. This is a portrait of the Duchess of Alba Goya painted in 1797 at the same time he was working on the Caprices. Although it's a little tough to see, she is pointing at his signature, which is painted down here in the sand. And perhaps you can see the similarity between these two figures or not. But anyway, moving on. This is one of the prints that drew attention to the Inquisition, of which Goya was also critical. The prisoner on trial here is named Perico, a disabled woman Goya knew who was arrested for selling love potions. She appears in front of a mob of officials robed in a typical penitential uniform called San Benito. She sits hunched over as if condemned in advance. Goya remarked, quote, badly done to treat an honorable woman in this way. A woman who, for nothing, served everyone so well and so usefully. Badly done, end quote. She was condemned, as was nearly everyone unfortunate enough to catch the eye of the Inquisition. Although he was likely a devout Christian, many of the Caprices are highly critical of the clergy, especially the 60,000 or so Spanish monks, a body that Goya saw as largely corrupt and prone to superstitious nonsense. Here he addresses the mortal sin of gluttony, as a trio of monks sit at a table gobbling down their food so quickly two of them appear to have burned their mouths. To the right, a fat monk laughs at his table mates, while another man approaches from the back, carrying another tray laden with more food. In a study for this picture, we can see that that Goya had considered addressing the sin of lust. The monk on the left was originally given an obviously phallic nose, so big that it must be held up out of the way with a stick so he can fill his stomach. Medical professionals were not spared either, and when an ass appears in a caricature like this one, it does indeed represent an ass. As you heard in the video, Goya was stricken with a serious and unknown illness, from which he recovered, although he was left almost totally deaf. Already prone to dark moods, this pushed him more deeply into a melancholy, frequently discontented frame of mind, which arguably contributed to the increasingly pessimistic artworks he produced. It very likely helps explain his cynicism when it came to the physicians of the period, whom he felt to be largely useless. Here, the doctor cum ass sits at the bedside of a dying man, his eyes closed, attempting to take the patient's pulse with a hoof. On his wrist, the ass sports a huge diamond, which we can understand he can afford after ripping off vulnerable patients. He asks the figures looming in the background, but what if he dies? In the commentary accompanying this image, Goya writes, quote, "The doctor is excellent, meditative, reflexive, calm, serious. What more can one ask for?" End quote. In an earlier version, Goya had included a female figure that looks suspiciously like the Duchess of Alba. Pairing her with the doctor, there's an implication that her love is as phony as the doctor's supposed expertise. It also links her with witchcraft, a profession Goya sometimes linked with physicians whose treatments relied more on superstition and ignorance than on the empirical science favored in the Enlightenment. In this way, we can also read the Duchess, if that is indeed who she is, as a bewitching figure. The large ass filling the background wears a ridiculous wig and eyeglasses and reads from what we may presume is a medical text, again largely useless at the time, at least in Goya's backwards Spain. As noted already, Goya also goes after witchcraft in his caprices. This is not to say that he believed in it. Rather, he is criticizing those superstitious fools who were convinced such things existed and feared them. Most women who were accused of witchcraft and subsequently murdered for it were what are often called wise women, who understood the medical benefits of various herbs and natural substances, like the poor doomed Perico we saw a few slides back, and used them to help people. Such women were often older, too, which might lead to a greater confidence, a trait many men found wildly inconvenient. Here, Goya presents the stereotypical image of a witch, a horrible, twisted, naked crone astride a broom. Beside her sits another naked woman, although clearly she is younger and has not yet been transformed by the evils of witchcraft. But of course, she is just at the beginning of her corruption by the older woman. Above them flies an owl, a creature of the night. It seems kind of funny that the broom is backwards until we consider its phallic qualities. Combined with the owl, whose name in Spanish is bubo, slang for prostitute, another creature of the night, the idea then is that the crone is corrupting the younger woman in more than one way. Here is the last of the series, called It Is Now Time. A group of 4 demons dressed in monk's robes stretch and yawn in the growing light. The night is ending, and it is time for them to sleep, as reason returns to those who have been slumbering. For this image, Goya wrote, quote, "Then, when dawn threatens, each one goes on his way, witches, hobgoblins, apparitions, and ghosts. It is a good thing that these creatures do not allow themselves to be seen except at night and under cover of darkness. Nobody has been able to find out where they shut themselves up and hide during the day. He who could catch a den full of hobgoblins and were to show them in a cage or at 10 o'clock in the morning in the Puerto del Sol would need no other inheritance." End quote. Shortly after the Caprices were published, They drew the attention of the Spanish Inquisition, and the series was censored. Of the original 240 copies, only 27 were actually sold. It was a massive financial loss for Goya. Of course, today they are highly valuable and still quite relevant. Okay, this is a good place to pause. I will meet you in part 2.